there wasn't any here when the state of Missouri decided that it wanted the state capital to be centrally located. There was no city. Jefferson City, the city of Jefferson, actually is its legal name, was created to be the seat of state government by the legislature in 1821. And this was a wilderness. There were a few people living here and there, but there was no town. And so the city was really created to be the seat of government. The town was laid out, but it took 5 years before there was enough here for the legislature to actually move here. So it was 1826. And even then, some legislators had to stay in tents. There weren't enough houses. There was one hotel in town. So it came into being because it was going to be the seat of permanent government. And the short version of the history of Jefferson City is that I think in the 19th century, we Jefferson Cityans wanted the capital. And we fought to keep it because most people in Missouri thought this is a crazy place to put a capital. It's an outpost of civilization. So we fought as hard as we could to keep the capital, and then we got it. And then we tried to figure out what to do with it. I mean, that's the history of the 20th century. We in many ways, are a people who have been at war with our destiny. We love being the capital city, but we don't like what's associated with that. We complain about legislators. We complain about the traffic. We complain about eminent domain and fights over land usage. So it is our destiny, and it's also a source of constant complaint. The capital most immediately before here was in St. Charles, and then before that, the legislature met in a variety of places in St. Louis. The most prominent was a hotel, and it even met in a private home in Madame Chateau's house. But the first real capital, the first building built to be a capital, was in St. Charles. But always from the beginning, there was this sense that the capital needed to be centrally located. It needed to be on the Missouri River, which was the I-70 of the early 19th century. That was the main artery of trade and traffic. And it was supposed to be, it had to be, according to the statute, within 40 miles of the mouth of the Osage River, which was the second most important trade and travel artery into the interior of the Ozarks of Missouri. So it had to be on the Missouri River and within 40 miles of the mouth of the Osage. And it also had to be on land that no one had ever claimed. So if you think about what I just said, the legislature said the capital has to be in a place that's easy to get to, but to which no one ever wanted to come. And no one had wanted to come here because there was nothing here, and most Missourians made their living farming. And on the south side of the river here, the land is hilly and rocky, and it wasn't good farming land, so nobody had ever wanted to come here. And that's why so many people thought throughout the 19th century that this was a terrible location. There was a man doing a survey of the Cumberland Highway from Virginia in the late 1820s, and he gets to Jefferson City, and he writes back to his brother in Virginia, and he describes Jefferson City this way. He says, "'Tis a rough-looking city indeed. It will never amount to anything." Well, it took a century. In the 19th century, most of the residents in the central Missouri area around the capital were farmers. And the main business of the city was, in fact, state government, still is. During the Civil War, there was a soldier from St. Louis stationed here, much against his will. He didn't want to be here. And he wrote back to his family and he said, if you take the government out of Jefferson City and you take the penitentiary, there wouldn't be anything left. And that's where most people worked. I mean, to understand Jefferson City's history, you have to understand the central role that state government played, and also, particularly in the 19th century, the role that the penitentiary played. In those years, Missourians, then like now, were hostile toward the notion of taxes. Yet we knew we had to have a penitentiary. So how are you going to have a prison if you don't want to pay taxes? We decided on a system called the lease system, where Jefferson City businessmen paid to get to run the penitentiary. They had to clothe, house, feed, and guard the inmates at their own expense. But in exchange for that, they could hire out the convict labor anywhere they wanted, any way they wanted. And so it was very profitable. And you could go to the penitentiary. The newspaper ran articles. You got a building to build, a fence to put up, hay to make. Just come to the prison, get you some convicts. So the prison was integral. I mean, there really was, in the early to mid-19th century, no industry here to speak of, apart from state government and the penitentiary. Now, in the late 19th century, the penitentiary actually attracted major industries because Missouri decided to hire out inmates to entrepreneurs, work them inside the penitentiary walls and factories, and sell the goods that prisoners made in interstate commerce. So, for perspective here, in the 1890s, if you were a factory owner in St. Louis or Chicago, you paid $2.25 a day for a laborer. But you could come to Jefferson City, put up a factory in the prison, and pay 40 to 50 cents a day. It was enormously profitable. And by the 1890s, there are 9 factories operating inside the Missouri State Penitentiary. And we are the trans-Mississippi shoe capital of the world. Where we have boot factories, shoe factories, saddle factories, clothing factories. And then later, when that system is outlawed, largely because organized labor argued that this was a discrimination against what was called square labor, people who were not convicts, many of those factories moved outside the prison walls, and that was a major source of employment for Central Missourians. But it would be a mistake to argue that there was ever any industry in Jefferson City that rivaled state government as an employer. One major obstacle also to moving, one major criticism of Jefferson City being the capital was that it was hard to get here, particularly after the railroads become prominent. There was no bridge across the river for more than 70 years. It's not until 1896 that local businessmen who were a part of a commercial club, which today is called the Chamber of Commerce, they organized a fundraising effort, raised their own money, built their own bridge for $325,000. Was the toll bridge. And that was all done in an effort to diminish the strength of the argument that Jefferson City is inaccessible by rail traffic because you can't get here from northern Missouri because there's no bridge across the Missouri River. In the 19th century, Jefferson Cityans tried to respond to and even anticipate criticisms of their remaining the state capital and to address those criticisms by doing things like building a bridge across the river. Jefferson Cityans were very sensitive, they still are, to the allegation that this is a small town and that it should be a bigger city if it's going to be the seat of government. So I think it is accurate to say that in many ways, in the 19th century, at least, Jefferson Cityans were constantly on guard. There was a tremendous rivalry with Sedalia, particularly right after the Civil War. Every legislative session, almost, a Sedalia legislator would introduce a bill and try to move the capital. And as a consequence of that, there was a rivalry between athletic teams and everything. My favorite story about that was that a newspaper ran an article, I think this is apocryphal, but supposedly right across the street at St. Peter's School, a nun was teaching a catechism class. And a little girl, she asked a little girl, what happens to people who've been bad when they die? And the answer is, they go to Sedalia. Cole County and Jefferson City were settled largely, both the county and the city were settled largely by people who had southern roots, primarily people from Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, who lived in a slave culture. So these people, when they came to Cole County in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, brought with them not only their slaves, if they owned them, but also their commitment to this slave culture. The dynamics of social interaction and political interaction began to change in the 1840s and 1850s as German immigrants came here in large numbers. And the Germans were vigorously opposed to slavery, largely because they thought it represented the antithesis of a capitalist system. And capitalism thrives because individuals are rewarded for their hard work, and slaves don't get that. So on the eve of the Civil War, there's a great tension here already between the Germans and their descendants and the upland Southerners and their descendants. It's instructive, for example, to note that John Breckinridge, who was the Confederate / slavery supporter who ran for the presidency in 1860. Didn't carry very many Missouri counties. He carried 20 counties out of 114 counties, but one of the counties he carried was this one, Cole County, which suggests that there was a strong support here. By contrast, Abraham Lincoln didn't carry this county. He carried a county, Gasconade County. He only carried 2 counties in Missouri, Gasconade and St. Louis, and that's where the large majority of the Germans were. So that I think that illustrates that tension. And of course, the governor we elected in 1860 was a man named Claiborne Fox Jackson, who was one of Missouri's largest slaveholders from the Arrow Rock community in Saline County. And he quickly, in his inaugural address, by the time he delivers his inaugural address in the first week of January 1861, he announces that his belief that the state of Missouri needs to identify with and go with what he refers to as our slaveholding sisters states of the South. So there is that tension. And in June of 1861, Union forces coming from St. Louis by boat unloaded more than 2,000 troops at the foot of the hill by the penitentiary and drove the sitting governor out of the city and chased him to Boonville, where the first, arguably, some people say the first battle of the Civil War was held. The Battle of Boonville took 20 minutes. The North won. But it sort of set the tone for what was going to happen in Jefferson City for the rest of the 4 years of the war. Throughout the war, if you think about this, there were 3,000 people who lived here roughly. But at times there were as many as 10 to 15,000 Union soldiers here. There were 3 to 5 soldiers for every citizen. It placed an enormous burden on the community, lots of tension, lots of fear and anxiety, always the concern throughout the war that the Confederate forces were going to invade Jefferson City and try to make Missouri the 12th state of the Confederacy. So there was tremendous anxiety. We know from hindsight that Jefferson City was never attacked, although we came real close in the fall of 1864. But I think it's hard to imagine the tension and the fear. In 1861, when those soldiers came in, those 2,000 soldiers, contingent of them were left here, 300 to guard the town while the others chased the governor and his forces. These were mostly German-speaking soldiers who had been led to believe they were going to be attacked any minute. They holed up in the Capitol. The enlisted men, as I recall, were in the House, the officers in the Senate, and then there was another group in the Supreme Court chambers. And there was a time when they captured some local gentlemen who they thought were Confederates, and they were going to hang them in the rotunda of the Capitol. So there was, and they went down, these soldiers, they went down to the prison and got some inmates to build barricades around the Capitol because they felt like they were under siege. And I think that kind of illustrates this incredible tension that existed here throughout the war.
So it's kind of like a fear culture almost.
It really was. It really was. Within sight of where we're standing, where the post office is, there was a woman who lived there named Henrietta Bruns, whose husband was the mayor, a German immigrant who was mayor largely because the Southern sympathizing Democrats were disenfranchised and couldn't vote. And she left behind many letters describing the scene. And she writes about from her upstairs of her house, looking out and seeing a Confederate flag flying over the Capitol. She lost a son at the Battle of Iuka in Mississippi. And she spares no words when criticizing the Democrats and the slaveholders of Missouri. And again, I think describing Jefferson City as living in total fear during that period is very accurate. My favorite thing about Jefferson City is that it is an endlessly intriguing place. I've spent the bulk of my life trying to understand it. The Capitol is a critical part of that. You can't understand Jefferson City without understanding that this is the seat of government. You can't understand that without understanding the connection with the penitentiary. I think that it's Jefferson City's history that makes it such an intriguing and endlessly fascinating place. So I would encourage people who are Missourians to come to Jefferson City and feel the history and seek to understand why this complex place has existed and has matured into such a fascinating city.